The hidden history of Healey Dell. In the north of Rochdale, concealed where the moorlands fall away into a deep green gorge, lies a place shaped over countless millions of years. This is Healey Dell, a landscape carved by the River Spodden, where nature and industry once collided, and where stories of fairies, floods and factories still linger throughout the valley. Beneath its canopy of many species of trees including oak, birch, beech and elm, the Spodden winds through the narrow passage known as the Thruch, a place of smooth gritstone ledges and tumbling waterfalls. Long before steam and iron reached the valley, ancient people harnessed this same river to grind corn and later to full cloth. The remains of many of these early mills still exist today, buried amongst shadows and undergrowth. As the Industrial Revolution gathered pace, the Dell became a hive of human energy. Mills and quarries lined the banks, and in the late 1800s, the Rochdale to Bacup railway struck its way through the Dell's heart. Its great stone viaduct, built from the same gritstone that underlies the area, spans the Spodden, an enduring monument to Victorian engineering. Conflict also reached the quiet valley, when the factories and mills of the Dell became part of a huge bomb-making and ammunitions hub in World War II. Over the years, the same river that powered the many industries also destroyed them. Devastating floods have torn through Healey Dell over the centuries, sweeping away bridges and mills and even reshaping parts of the gorge itself. Occasionally, nature reminds the valley and its many modern-day visitors who is truly in control. Over time, the mills fell silent, the trains stopped running and the Dell began to heal. Now the area is a large and immensely popular nature reserve, where woodland and moss reclaim the remnants of the past. Walkers and cyclists in their thousands cross the old railway viaduct. Photographers stand and marvel at the rush of the River Spodden and its many waterfalls. And hikers and ramblers follow the paths and trails that trace a history written in rock, water and human hands. Healey Dell is a natural jewel in Rochdale's crown, where geology meets folklore, where industry met its limits, and where the Pennine wilderness quietly and beautifully took back what was once its own. Long before the factories and the hum of industry, Healey Dell was a wild and ancient landscape, rich with wildlife and water. Today it lies on the edge of Rochdale in an area that was once on the border of the vast forest of Rosendale, but more than 1,000 years ago it was part of a rugged borderland between Anglo-Saxon Mercia and the Norse-settled territories of Northumbria. In those early medieval centuries, when the stories of the Vikings and their descendants were being written across northern England, Healey Dell was already a place of life, work and legend. The earliest people to shape this landscape arrived long before recorded history. Archaeological evidence across the Pennines shows that Neolithic and Bronze Age farmers cleared the forest for grazing and left behind traces of ancient field systems. By the time of the Romans, the area was part of the Iron Age Brigantian tribal lands, dotted with small farmsteads and trackways linking it to early roads that crossed the Pennine Hills. In nearby Smallshaw Wood, shaw being Anglo-Saxon for copse or small woodland, across the old and well-preserved Packhorse Bridge, evidence of a triple-ditched enclosure at the base of a hill were discovered by a local archaeologist. Upon further investigation, it was found that the Coucher Book of Whalley Abbey, some 800 years old, mentions this site and referred to it as ancient even back then. When the Romans withdrew in the 5th century, local communities remained, farming the valleys and maintaining the clearings along the River Spodden. By the early Middle Ages, these isolated hamlets and farms had become part of the expanding Anglo-Saxon world. The name Healey comes from Old English, he-lee, meaning high clearing or woodland meadow on the hill. It was exactly that, a steep-sided valley opening out into open ground above the river, surrounded by thick woods and heather-covered slopes. Settlers here would have lived in small timber halls, keeping sheep and cattle on the uplands and growing barley and oats on the flatter terraces near the river. Then, around the 9th and 10th centuries, new influences arrived from across the North Sea. Viking raiders first came to plunder but many stayed to settle, mixing with the existing Anglo-Saxon population. The Norse brought their own customs, farming methods and language, and their legacy remains in the place names scattered across Lancashire. The personal name Gamel, from the Old Norse Gamal, meaning old or wise, appears again and again in local records from this period. Gamel was not a mythical figure, but the name of a real man. A Norse-descended thane, which meant a land-owning freeman who was obliged to fight for the king, who held estates across the north before the Norman conquest. In the Domesday Book of 1086, which recorded who held what land before and after William the Conqueror's invasion, the name Gamel appears multiple times in the region, and he held land in the area called Rochdale, later known as Rochdale, which was part of the Salford Hundred. The Salford Hundred was a subdivision of the county of Lancashire. He would have been a local chieftain or freeholder, a man of standing, possibly descended from Viking settlers who had made peace with the English crown, and was believed to have been based in Cowderdale, West Yorkshire. Life in Healey Dell during Gamel's time would have been hard but steady. Families lived off the land, relying on the forests for timber and the River Spodden for water and fish. Livestock grazed the valley slopes, and the air would have been filled with the sound of mills powered by water wheels, early corn mills that harnessed the river's flow. The Dell itself, with its waterfalls and stone outcrops, may have held spiritual significance for these early inhabitants. Natural features like the Fairy King's Throne and the deep rock pools of the Dell, which still carry a sense of mystery today, may once have been sacred places or gathering spots in pre-Christian times. The landscape at this time was dotted with clearings and farmsteads, and each name tells a story. Many of the surrounding areas, places ending in Thwaite, By or Holm, have Norse origins, showing how Viking settlers had integrated with local English communities. Rochdale itself likely grew from one such settlement. The fusion of languages and cultures created a unique northern identity, neither wholly Saxon nor Viking, but something in between. When the Normans arrived in 1066, they found a land already shaped by centuries of such mixing. After the conquest, the lands once held by men like Gamel were seized and granted to Norman lords loyal to the new king. Yet the old families did not vanish overnight. In later medieval records, Old Norse names such as Dolphinus de Healey appear. This medieval family, who were among the early landholders of the area, took their name from the valley and built a substantial house where Healey Hall now sits on Shawcliffe Road around the 13th century, possibly as early as 1250. The de Healey family remained in possession of the estate until the reign of Edward III in the 14th century. In 1483, ownership passed to John Chadwick, whose family would remain closely associated with the property for generations. The Chadwicks became woven into local history and folklore, especially through tales of Oliver Chadwick and Lady Eleanor Byron. Their tragic love story and supposed encounters with the supernatural are immortalised in legends surrounding the Fairies Chapel in the Dell below. Early accounts describe the medieval Healey Hall as a large, somewhat ungainly building made of timber and plaster. The antiquarian John Roby, writing in the 19th century, referred to it as a huge, unsightly structure, typical of medieval manor houses before later rebuilding. Over time, the old house was replaced and remodelled several times. Multiple date stones can be found around the complex. Records mention a reconstruction in 1618, and the present building with its adjoining farmhouse dates from 1774, the year carved into the keystone above one of its entrances. The Georgian house that stands today is a handsome ashlar stone building. Healey Hall was officially recognised for its historical and architectural importance in 1951, when it was designated a Grade 2 listed building on the National Heritage List for England. Documents from the Victorian period show that members of the Chadwick family still held property interests in the area, alongside emerging local industrialists such as Jacob Tweedale and Sons. The Tweedales would eventually rent Healey Hall in the early 1800s, as well as several mills within the Dell, and could be seen in these images enjoying a day out in the beauty spot. The hall passed through many more hands, and in 1903, the then owner Gerald Radcliffe sold the hall and its associated buildings to Robert Taylor Heap, who later also purchased Healey Dell and the adjoining land. In 1908, Heap transferred ownership of the property to Richard Heap. Richard Heap promoted public access to the dell, funding the construction of the paths and steps, including the steep twisting set leading down to the fairy chapel, and also 2 ornamental shelters and at least 9 wooden and iron benches. One shelter was built beside the area known as the Spore, while the other stood near the fairy chapel where a modern bench is now located. Local quarryman Samuel Jackson and his team carried out the works. He can be seen here at the opening in 1912, kneeling in the centre with his builders at the Spore shelter. Today Healey Hall remains privately owned. Parts of the adjoining farmhouse and outbuildings have been adapted for residential and holiday use, while the main house itself has in recent decades served as a country residence and occasional events venue. Though not open to the public, the hall is still clearly visible from the road, its stone facade looking out across the ancient tree-lined valley. As those early centuries passed, Healey Dell remained a place of quiet rural life, a cluster of farms, woodland and mills. Medieval villagers built small stone halls and farmhouses, some of which evolved into the estates and hamlets we know today. The valley's rich natural resources, fast-flowing water, timber and stone, would one day make it an ideal location for the textile industry. But in those primitive years, it was simply a self-sufficient landscape, far removed from cities or markets. If you stood in Healey Dell 1,000 years ago, you would have seen smoke rising from turf-roofed halls, sheep grazing along the ridges, and farmers working the meadows near the river. You would have met broad-shouldered farmers or minor nobles, speaking a blend of Old English and Old Norse, tending to their land and livestock, unaware that their names would echo through local history long after their wooden halls had rotted away. Today, little physical evidence remains from that early period, other than the fortification at Smallshaw. No Viking hoards have been found in the dell, no stone crosses or rune carvings, yet the land itself offers clues to its origins. The shape of the fields, the line of the river, and the ancient names that survive on maps all point back to that era of transition, when Healey Dell was not yet an industrial powerhouse, but a borderland of farmers, woodsmen and Norse settlers living out their lives in a wild northern valley. Long before the hum of looms, the thunder of trains crossing the Viaduct and the poison of asbestos, the dell was a cradle of early English and Viking life. The River Spodden is a short, energetic watercourse that begins on the Pennine Moorlands near Whitworth, and in roughly 7.5 miles drops hundreds of metres on its way to join the River Roch. In that brief distance it has carved one of the South Pennine's most intimate gorges. Over the centuries, the River Spodden itself has been known by several different names. In the 1500s it was recorded as Sprotten, and by the 1600s it had become known as Spotten Brook. The river gave its name to the township of Spotland, one of the 4 original townships in the parish of Rochdale, which was first known as Spoddenland. The Spodden's source begins here, high on Shawforth Moor at Freehold's top, northeast of Shawforth village in Whitworth. This inconspicuous stream amongst the rushes is the culmination of vast amounts of rainwater filtering through the layers of peat before finally surfacing at this spot. The river then gradually gathers pace as it is fed by 9 direct tributary brooks and another 4 indirect ones over its entire course, before it eventually comes to an end as it converges with the River Roch not far from Rochdale town centre. The geological history of the dell is one of rock, ice and water working together across deep time. Underlying the valley where the dell is located are coarse carboniferous sandstones, the local millstone grit, a resistant bedrock that forces the Spodden into narrow, steep-sided channels where its flow is focused and its multiple waterfalls are formed. Beds of gritstone, their fractures and bedding planes create discrete ledges and steps, where the river negotiates a hard ledge or is squeezed into a tight space. It plunges, scours and drills plunge pools. Over millennia, these processes have smoothed steps, carved basins and produced the sculpted rock forms that walkers and photographers prize today. But vast ice age left its mark too. Glaciers scoured the high ground and deposited boulder clay and gravels, and when the ice retreated, powerful meltwaters reorganised drainage and concentrated flow into the Spodden's channel. Since deglaciation, the constant work of running water, vertical incision where energy is greatest, lateral erosion as the channel swings, and abrasion by sediment-laden flows has cut the thrutch, the local word for the gorge's constricted throat. Here, the river is forced through a narrow band of gritstone, speeds rise, erosion intensifies, and a sequence of cascades and stepped falls is produced rather than one single drop. Periodic storms and flash floods continue to reshape the gorge, moving boulders, recutting banks, and refreshing the carved features so that the dell's appearance remains dynamic. Tucked within one such narrow gorge once stood one of Rochdale's most curious and enchanting natural landmarks, the Fairies' Chapel. This was not a building, but a natural rock formation carved by centuries of flowing water into the shape of a small chamber, complete with what looked like a pulpit, reading desk and seats, all formed from smooth gritstone. To the people of the surrounding moorlands, the place seemed otherworldly, and Georgian and Victorian families would flock to visit the dell. A bench and an information board are now located at the opening to the long winding steps that lead steeply down to the chapel, built by Sam Jackson and his team over 100 years ago. Mist rising from the river, the sound of rushing water, and the strange sculpted shapes of the rock gave it the air of a tiny subterranean church. The name Fairies' Chapel grew naturally from this blend of geological wonder and local folklore that came to define Healey Dell. Many tales and legends soon gathered around the spot. One tale tells how the king of the fairies turned a coven of witches to storm within the gorge, leaving their petrified shapes to form the chapel itself. Another speaks of Lady Eleanor Byron, said to have lived in the reign of Edward IV, who was lured to the chapel by a prophecy that she would be maid, wife and widow in one day. The prophecy, the legend claims, came true when her husband was killed on their wedding night. Such stories mingle with older folk beliefs about fairies, spirits and witches haunting lonely wooded places, echoes of a time when people explained strange natural formations before geology had a name for them. Beneath the legends lay a purely natural marvel. The chapel was a sculpted alcove in the millstone grit, carved over thousands of years by the erosive power of the Spodden. The river rushing through the tight confines of the thrutch had worn the sandstone into smooth hollows and ledges, while seasonal floods deepened its curves and plunge pools. Visitors in the early 19th century described it as a hidden grotto where the rock seemed alive with faces and forms, a chapel shaped by human hands rather than nature. But the Fairies' Chapel as it once appeared was destroyed in the catastrophic flood of the 4th of July 1838. That summer, a violent storm broke over the Pennines, sending torrents of rain and hail down the valleys. The Spodden rose several metres in a matter of hours, tearing through bridges and mills, sweeping away entire sections of riverbank. When the floodwaters subsided, the chapel had been ravaged, its carved pulpit and seats shattered or buried beneath debris, the entrance partially collapsed, and much of the delicate shaping that inspired such wonder was lost forever. The flood transformed the lower Spodden Valley, destroying much and even altering the river's course in places. Though the Fairies' Chapel never fully recovered its former shape, the place retains an aura of mystery. The rock walls of the thrutch still bear smooth hollows where water has worked for ages, and moss now carpets the surviving fragments of the formation. Visitors who follow the trail can still find the spot down the steps where the chapel once stood, marked on maps and remembered in local lore. The Fairy King's throne or coffin rock is still there to this day, with its carved bowl, possibly made by Neolithic hands or even earlier, as a recess to place offerings to ancient gods or river spirits. Standing there with the echo of the river below, it is easy to imagine the fairies and witches of the old tales lingering amongst the stones. Now the Fairies' Chapel lives on, not as a visible monument, but as part of the layered identity of Healey Dell, a meeting point of geology, legend and memory. The same natural forces that created it also destroyed it, leaving behind a tale that bridges the mythical and the real. Humans have long been drawn to the Spodden's power. The steep gradients and reliable flows were ideal for corn and fulling mills, and later for small woolen and cotton works. Coal was extracted from many small collieries, and industrial relics exist in every nook and cranny. Along the banks lie traces of stonework, weirs, dam ponds and even aqueduct towers that mark early mill sites. The Industrial Revolution brought prosperity, but also vulnerability. The same 1838 flood that destroyed the Fairies Chapel swept away bridges and mills, leaving a trail of damage that reshaped the valley. The first industrial site on our list, Brotherhood Mill, sat in the southernmost tip of Healey Dell. Local records and old maps show that a mill was operating at Brotherhood by the late 18th century, first as a wool carding mill and later converted to cotton spinning during the 19th century textile boom. It was built in the late 1700s by John Royd of Fairwinch, one of the well-known Royds family, and was also known as Broader Road Mill. It was built on the Brotherhood estate, which in the medieval period had belonged to Whalley Abbey, and which after the dissolution was acquired by the Holts of Gristlehurst. By the mid-1800s, Brotherhood Mill appeared clearly on Ordnance Survey maps, with an L-shaped building and a substantial mill lodge, or reservoir, to the east. Like many mills in the Spodden Valley, it relied on its complex system of leats and bywashes to manage the water supply. The mill changed hands numerous times and was also owned by the Tweedales, who would go on to own many industries in the valley. The mill expanded over its lifetime and carried on into the early 20th century, but by the 1930s textile production had stopped. In the later 20th century, the site was absorbed into the area owned by Turner Brothers, whose large asbestos and engineering works dominated the lower part of the valley. Local accounts say that Turners used the site for industrial purposes and eventually demolished the remaining mill buildings, leaving only the pump house and the lodge as reminders of the earlier works. The mill lodge with its embankment and overflow steps is still visible, and traces of water channels, low mounds and curbstones mark the area where the buildings once stood. Harwich Mill stood further north in the valley. It was erected in the 1850s by brothers Robert, Edmund and Stephen Leach as a small woolen and flannel mill, and it was one of the first of a string of water-powered sites that exploited the Spodden's flow. The brothers were the son of John Leach, who was originally part of Leach, Tweedale & Co., who left the business to start his own company, and they lived at the Harwich on Shawclough Road. By around 1900, Harwich Mill had already ceased its textile production. During the 20th century, the buildings passed into different hands and were used by local industry, with later accounts recording the Turner Brothers site also using this mill for storage. Over time, the standing mill buildings fell into decline and were demolished in the mid to late 20th century. Demolition, spoil and later tipping left the site largely as landscape mounds and earthworks rather than intact structures. Today, very little remains. The mill's above ground fabric is almost completely gone, and what survives are sections of walling, buried footings, embanked reservoir remnants and visible mounds that mark where this early building once stood. A row of workers' cottages were also located nearby, across the road in this setback area. Next on the list, we pass through a gate to the left of Dell Road and down to Meanley's Mill, which was an early small water-powered woolen mill, whose story is written mainly in old maps, a few parish entries and archaeological notes, rather than in surviving bricks and mortar. The mill was built by Benjamin Meanley in the late 1700s and is recorded on early 19th century plans and mid-century Ordnance Survey sheets as an L-shaped woolen mill supplied by a reservoir and leat taken from the Spodden. By the end of the 19th century it had already fallen out of use, and the site was shown as vacant on later maps. During its lifetime it was also known as Lower Fold Mill and Clough Mill. Today what survives are extremely faint landscape traces and the occasional buried footings where industrious stone once caught the mill wheel's force. On the ground there are very few standing remains attributed to Meanley's Mill. Stones have been taken for reuse elsewhere, and vegetation rapidly obscures low masonry. Nevertheless, the possibility of subsurface survival, robbed foundations, a wheel pit or other buried structural features may remain hidden under silt and leaf mould. Trade directories, valuation books and local parish registers pick up the place name in the 19th century. An 1881 baptism entry listed a board called Meanley Mill, confirming that the site was more than a name on a map. It functioned as an address and also a point of occupation in the late 1800s. By the late Victorian era, the mill site had been vacated. Building stone was evidently reused for cottages and other local construction. Waterworks were altered to serve other mills, and the Dell's tendency to reclaim industrial ground with woodland and scrub means most traces are now subtle. Continuing north down Dell Road, we come to the site of Healey Hall Mill, also known as Healey Bottom Mill, which was one of the earliest industries to develop around the Healey Hall estate. Long before its later conversion to an ammunition factory during the Second World War, it was a small but active part of the valley's early industrial life. The mill's origins go back to the late 1700s and early 1800s. Healey Hall Mill was part of the early wave of industry, a modest estate-linked enterprise that likely began as a corn or fullwing mill and later adapted to textile work as the wool trade expanded across the Pennine valleys. Its position close to Healey Hall itself suggests it was first built to serve the estate or its tenants, making use of the watercourses and stone available nearby. In its early years, the mill would have relied entirely on water power. As industry grew through the 19th century, Healey Hall Mill expanded in size and machinery, following the pattern of other mills in the valley. Stone-built ranges housed looms, carding rooms or fulling stocks, and small cottages for workers stood close by. Throughout the 1800s, ownership and use of the mill changed hands several times. Families connected with Healey Hall, such as the Chadwicks and Tweedales, appear in estate and valuation records, and later entries in trade directories suggest the mill continued working into the later Victorian years. It was never a large industrial complex, but rather a steady local employer, producing or finishing cloth for nearby markets in Rochdale and Whitworth. By the end of the 19th century, Healey Hall Mill began to lose ground to larger steam-driven factories elsewhere. Some of its machinery was removed, parts of the building were reused, and the site gradually fell into partial disuse. When the 20th century began, the old mill buildings still stood, ready to be adapted for new purposes, one of which would be its later wartime conversion. The complex went through 4 distinct phases of renovation and expansion in its lifetime, but some remains of the first Tweedale mill endure. Several sections of walling still stand, some parts built upon by the way to red brick mill. The old Leeton mill pond can be found hidden among the trees of the Dell, now repurposed and used by the Rochdale Walton Angling Society. Pushing on up the road and under the viaduct, we come to one of the most evocative industrial remains in the Dell, situated down to the left. This ruin is known in local speech as Thowd Millith Thrutch, the old mill in the Thrutch. Over its lifetime, the building had many other names. The earliest known is Healey Dean Mill, but Healey Mill is also found, and by the 19th century, Healey Old Mill, and also simply Old Mill. Probably the oldest mill in the valley, the building's story reaches back into the 17th century, and documents show that it was operating as a fulling mill by 1676. Records from the 1400s mention a corn mill in this area, and some evidence even suggests that a much more ancient Anglo-Saxon corn mill was once located in the same spot. Fulling was the process of cleansing and shrinking woven woolen cloth to thicken it. It required repeated pounding and the steady supply of water for fulling stocks, or later mechanical fulling manges. The mill's location in the Thrutch, where the Spodden speed and energy concentrate, made practical sense. There the building could be compactly sited and its water wheel fed by a diverted channel and mill pond. The mill was built to fit the valley. Masonry arches spanned the stream with supporting floors and machinery above the river, where flat ground was scarce. Surviving stonework and contemporary descriptions allow a clear picture of how the mill worked. A weir upstream collected water into a race that delivered it to a wheel pit. Cut channels and tunnels in the rock can still be traced where they led to mill ponds or returned discharged water to the Spodden. Inside the building were the pounding floors and drying rooms necessary for finishing cloth. Several vats still exist on the site, used for adding the subtle blue dye to the cloth to enhance its white appearance. The remains of 4 sulphur stoves can also be found where cloth was bleached using sulphur dioxide fumes. Traces of the lethal concoction used in the process can be seen on the remaining stone walls. Over time, small water-powered establishments such as Thode Mill adapted incrementally, improvements to machinery, occasional adoption of steam auxiliaries at some mills in the valley, and changing labour regimes, but the essential layout, water diverted, wheel turning, cloth treated and dried, remained recognisable across generations. Another small building stood on the eastern side of the track that leads to Dell Road, where now just a section of wall and mossy stones remain. A large 3-floored warehouse used to store woolen cloth for fulling and finished product for collection was situated across the track above the mill. Stonework from the original building and remains of the sewer can still be located amongst the undergrowth. The last true remnants of the mill, the 2 iconic external stone arch supports that straddled the Spodden, would become known locally as the Fairy Bridges. In 2015, the Boxing Day floods that hit the northwest of England saw the river once again swell to unprecedented levels. In similar fashion to the flood of 1838, one of the beloved Fairy Bridges, which had stood here for centuries, was sadly washed away and lost forever to the Spodden. Further north and over the Station Road Bridge, Broadley Mills once stood proudly on both sides of the river and played a central role in the valley's long industrial history. Today only a few traces of the mills remain: moss-covered foundations, fragments of walls, and the old stone gateposts that once marked the entrance to the mill owner's house. A narrow track leads off to the right of Station Road, winding down toward the old mill sites and the path to Broadley Station. Broadley Mill's history reaches back nearly 5 centuries. The earliest reference dates to 1556, when the site operated as a simple corn mill powered by a water wheel. By 1640, records show that the property was owned by the prosperous Milne family from Milnrow. The mill continued to grind grain for local farmers for well over a century before the industrial transformation of the 1700s reshaped the landscape of Healey Dell. Around 1760, the mill was purchased by John Chaplick of Healey Hall. In 1804, he sold it to brothers John and Robert Holt, who modernised and expanded the site, converting the old corn mill into a woolen mill producing flannel. The Holts in turn sold the property to the Tweedale family. These significant figures in Rochdale's industrial and civic life were responsible for building Christ Church in Healey and later gave their name to Tweedale Street. Under the Tweedale's ownership, Broadley Mills grew from a single building into a large complex of 3 mills on the same site. The family diversified production by adding a cotton mill alongside the woolen works, taking advantage of the growing demand for cotton textiles during the early 19th century. This transformation reflected the rapid industrialisation of Rochdale and the wider Lancashire region as water-powered mills began to dominate valley landscapes. Remnants of the mill's later period can still be found along the path toward the old Broadley station. Near a stone gatepost lies a circular depression, the remains of the mill's gas holder. The mill generated gas as a byproduct of its processes and stored it for reuse, an early example of industrial recycling in the 19th century. In January 1847, before Christ Church was built, Broadley Mill served an unexpected community role. It temporarily housed both a church and a school for Healey's growing population. Construction of the permanent church began 2 years later, in 1849. However, the fortunes of the mill declined in the later 19th century. A devastating fire in November of 1873 caused an estimated £8,000 worth of damage, a huge sum at the time, and tragically claimed the life of Superintendent Tipping of the Whitworth Fire Brigade. The fire hastened the site's decline, and by around 1880 the mills had ceased production. By 1906 they stood derelict, their roofs gone and walls crumbling. Many of the stone blocks from the ruined buildings were later salvaged and reused in local construction projects, including houses at Greenbank and along Market Street in Whitworth. Even in ruin, Broadley Mills retained an air of mystery and memory. Local folklore tells of a ghostly figure, a man wearing a bowler hat, seen standing by the twin stone gateposts that still guard the path down to the mill site. He's said to be one of the former owners, forever watching over the place where generations of Rochdale workers once laboured. Today the remains of Broadley Mills lie silent within the greenery of the reserve. The crumbling foundations are a reminder of the centuries-long evolution of local industry, from a humble corn mill in Tudor times to a bustling cotton and woolen complex at the height of the Industrial Revolution. Higher up the left side of the valley, Broadley Wood Cotton Mill once stood beside a small tributary of the River Spodden in a location now near the car park on Station Road. Built in the early 1800s, possibly by the Lord family, the mill operated for many years under the ownership of Charles Haig, who took over around 1824 and managed it for more than 4 decades. Originally powered by water, the mill used a dammed lodge to feed a head race that channeled water to a wheel beneath the central part of the mill. One of these lodges is now used for fishing, with the other being completely overgrown. Any excess water flowed through an overflow channel or bywash that ran along the south side of the site. Because the stream that served Broadley Wood was small, the water supply often proved unreliable. This limitation led Haig to introduce steam power, making Broadley Wood one of the first mills in Healey Dell to move away from traditional water power. By 1879, records show that the mill was powered entirely by a 45 horsepower steam engine. By 1890, the site had developed into a substantial complex of 4 main buildings. There was a 4-storey mill block, a single-storey weaving shed measuring about 40 metres by 18 metres, and an engine house about 3.5 stories high, which contained large brick and stone engine beds. These engine beds still survive on the site today, along with fragments of the old stone walls that once bordered the mill dam. After changing ownership sometime after 1874, Broadley Wood Mill continued in use for several more decades but eventually fell into decline. In 1927 the business went into liquidation and the buildings were finally demolished around 1960. Today only traces of the once busy mill remain in the peaceful woodland. Visitors walking through the reserve can still see the remnants of stone walling near the dam, the old engine beds, and the ruins of the stables on the southeast side of the site. The horses that stayed here pulled carts loaded with the mill's products of corduroy to a site in Bacup for finishing. Original gateposts remain that led to the mill's offices. Although little of the complex survives, Broadley Wood remains an important part of Healey Dell's industrial heritage. Its early adoption of steam power reflected the wider transformation of the textile industry during the 19th century, as mills across Lancashire began to make the move from water to steam. Carrying on north up the old railway line was Broadley Stone Rubbing Mill on the left, not far from Broadley Station. It was once a sophisticated industrial workshop dedicated to the finishing of quarried stone. In its day, raw slabs, sets, flags and curbs were dressed, polished and refined here, transforming rugged blocks into smooth, serviceable surfaces destined for streets and buildings across the country. Though many quarries and stoneworks in the Rochdale area reached back earlier, Broadley's rise was closely associated with the expansion of mineral tramways and the railway network. The ability to move heavy finished stone by rail made it commercially feasible to locate a polishing mill in a valley like Healey Dell. The mill may have originated as an offshoot of Henry Hayes & Co., a stone merchant firm based in Stacksteads near Bacup, that in the 1880s advertised a wide range of products, all high-grade stone polished or self-faced for curbs, flags and channels. As stone business in Rochdale expanded, the establishment of a dedicated polishing facility adjacent to quarry rail links made sense. By about 1890, Broadley siding on the Rochdale to Bacup branch had become the terminus of a narrow-gauge mineral tramway that stretched eastward across the quarries on Rewley Moor. Stone from those quarries would be brought by tram into Broadley siding, ready for final finishing before onward shipment to market. The mill even had its own internal tram road to ferry materials around within the complex. The northern half comprised a long building housing 2 grinding pits set on either side of a central engine bed. Polishing tables, long-wheeled tables bearing the stone slabs, ran beneath concentric rotating iron rings, driven by the vertical shafts of power machinery. The polishing area was mostly open-sided, while the engine itself was held within a separate enclosure. A central bay more than likely housed the boiler. To the south was a narrower bay with a chimney at its western end, possibly serving as an auxiliary boiler or flue chamber. To the extreme south lay the dressing shed, now largely reduced to a linear depression. It was once divided into two equal bays and formed the zone where preliminary finishing and edging would have taken place. By the 1920s, maps and local records show the mill only as a shell, the machinery gone and the roof vanished. Yet even today visitors can discern the ghostly skeleton of Broadley. Stone walls partially standing, the hollows of former pits, and the faint outlines of engine beds cut into rock or masonry. A local legend claims that stone dressed at Broadley found its way into London's Trafalgar Square. While there is no confirmed documentation tying Broadley to that project, the Rosendale and Haslingden region long held a reputation for producing durable, high-quality flags used in prestigious paving projects. In that broader sense, it's quite possible that Healey Dell's stone contributed to such schemes, even if the legend remains unproven in full. Its ruins now huddle in the quiet of the dell, a silent witness to the age when moorland rock became city pavement. The northernmost and final location, situated to the right of the track, Tunnicliffe Mill, existed for more than a century. Constructed in the late 1780s and owned by the Chadwicks of Healey Hall, Tunnicliffe began life as another fowing mill and grew over the 19th century into a substantial mechanised complex. By the mid-1800s, the mill formed part of an organised industrial landscape. Tenterfields stood on higher slopes, a long leat took water to a tier-shaped lodge immediately north of the mill, and ancillary ranges held stoves, washrooms and warehouses. Documentary records record both water and steam power working side by side. 19th century accounts list a sizable water wheel alongside steam engines, with records noting a 24 horsepower steam engine, a 12 horsepower wheel in the 1840s, and later a 20 horsepower condensing engine alongside a 27 horsepower water wheel. Those details show Tunnicliffe's transition from purely water driven craft to the mixed mechanised operations typical of the period. Owners and operators moved through the site's history in ways that reflect local industrial networks. Early occupants recorded in rate books and valuation records include names such as James Wrigley, and from the 1820s Thomas Holland, documented as a fower. By the mid-century, the Tweedale family once again, Jacob Tweedale and Sons among them, figure in directories and valuation lists. The mill's fortunes therefore tied into the wider web of families and firms operating on the Spodden. Economic stresses in the later 19th century, the usual mix of market pressures, competition and financial difficulty, culminated in the firm's troubles in the early 1880s. Tunnicliffe was shown disused on the 1890 Ordnance Survey and listed as ruinous by 1908. What remains today is quiet and small, and the mill's footprint has largely reverted to woodland. The visible remains are scamped, fragmentary masonry, traces of the filled lodge and the silted leat, but beneath the leaf litter there may survive foundations, floor surfaces and wheel pit features concealed under demolition rubble and soil. Tunnicliffe's, and indeed all the mills in the valley's story, is a familiar Pennine arc. An ambitious water mill that adopted steam, played a steady role in local textile working through the centuries and then closed, fell into ruin and was gradually reabsorbed into the valley's naturalising landscape. When the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway began its expansion through the hill country north of Rochdale in the mid-19th century, it was responding to the industrial pulse of the Spodden Valley. The mills and quarries scattered along the steep-sided corridor demanded efficient ways to move coal, cloth and stone. Wagon roads and horse-drawn carts had served the valley for generations, but by the 1860s the great age of steam was in full swing. The decision to drive a branch line from Rochdale to Bacup was both a practical investment and an act of industrial confidence, an assertion that the remote Pennine valleys would continue to feed the economic power of Lancashire's mill towns. The Rochdale to Bacup branch, built by the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, was constructed in stages. The first section from Rochdale to Facet opened to traffic in 1870. The final extension from Facet to Bacup followed in 1881. At its height, the line threaded northward from Rochdale, visiting 9 stations in total. Wardleworth, Shawcliffe and Heeley, Broadley, Whitworth, Facet, Shawforth, Britannia, and finally Bacup, where it terminated. The route covered a mere 9 miles, yet within that short distance it traversed some of the most demanding terrain in the South Pennines: long inclines, deep cuttings and tightly folded moorland valleys that called for both ingenuity and engineering audacity. Among the line's most striking achievements was the Heeley Dell Viaduct, completed in 1867 as part of the original Rochdale to Facet works. Constructed of a locally quarried millstone grit, it spans the wooded gorge of the River Spodden in a graceful sequence of 8 arches, each roughly 30 feet across, rising over 100 feet above the water. The viaduct carried a single line of track and became an emblem of Victorian confidence in both craftsmanship and geology, a structure at once robust and elegant, harmonising with the rock from which it was made. Even before its completion, local newspapers marvelled at the sight of masons balanced on wooden scaffolds high above the dell, laying the pale gritstone blocks that would soon carry the iron road northward. Once open, the branch quickly became a lifeline for the valley's communities. The steep gradients and reliable river flows had long powered fulling and cotton mills. Now the same natural contours that had challenged the builders gave the railway its scenic drama. Passenger trains connected Rochdale with the smaller industrial villages of Whitworth and Facet, carrying mill workers, school children and day trippers. Freight trains hauled coal, raw cotton, quarried stone and finished cloth, while sidings served individual mills and quarries that clung to the narrow valley floor. The route crossed several bridges and ran through multiple tunnels. Not far from Wardleworth, the 18-arch Roach Viaduct was constructed to carry the line over the River Roach. After the Facet branch closed completely in 1967 and the rails were removed, work began on demolishing the viaduct. Although it had been difficult to construct, it proved surprisingly cooperative when the time came to take it down. On the 11th of July 1972, during a test explosion on a single arch, a chain reaction occurred and 11 arches collapsed unexpectedly. The collapse fractured gas and water mains and blocked off Entwistle Road. There were only 2 level crossings on the line. These were at Tong Lane between Whitworth and Facet, where a signal box known as Tong End was provided, and an unmanned crossing at Thrum Hall between Wardleworth and Shawcliffe, where the original gate posts still stand to this day. The railway's presence transformed the landscape. New bridges, embankments and culverts altered the hydrology of the Spodden, complementing the weirs and goits already built to feed mill ponds. The valley floor became a linear corridor of industry, stone tips and mill chimneys rising through the smoke, the beat of machinery echoing from the gorge. Above the timeless River Spodden, the railway's stone arches seemed almost suspended between nature and industry, a literal bridge between eras. Operationally, the Rochdale to Bacup line was always more of a community artery than a trunk route. Passenger services were frequent but short, with modest locomotives and light rolling stock, negotiating tight curves and inclines. The line's busiest traffic was freight, especially stone from the local quarries and coal for the mills. For decades it provided steady work and steady revenue, but the mid-20th century brought change. The growth of road transport after the First World War eroded the branch's passenger base, and by the 1930s, motor buses offered cheaper, more flexible travel between the same towns. Wartime economies finally sealed its fate. In June 1947, passenger services were withdrawn. The fish were described as a temporary suspension due to fuel shortages, but in practice never reinstated. Freight traffic lingered longer. Goods wagons still rattled through the Dow into the early 1960s, serving the remaining mills at Fassett and Whitworth. Occasional enthusiast excursions, that last being rail tours in the mid-1960s, crossed the Viaduct before the line was finally dismantled. The tracks were lifted, the stations demolished or converted to other uses, and stillness reclaimed the valley. By the 1970s, trees had seeded between the old ballast, and the Viaduct, once a symbol of industrial vitality, had become a romantic ruin arching above the green ravine. Today, the Healey Dell Viaduct is a Grade 2 listed structure, recognised for its historic and architectural significance. Its gritstone arches remain sound, the craftsmanship as visible as ever, though the rails are long gone. The nearby Station Road Bridge, which once led down to Broadley Station, although smaller, is no less impressive, and was built around the same time, sharing architectural features with its colossal neighbour. The former track bed through the Dell now forms part of the Healey Dell Nature Reserve and is incorporated into a network of walking and cycling trails. Where locomotives once hauled coal wagons, walkers and cyclists now follow the same line through dappled woodland, listening to the rush of the Spodden below. The Viaduct stands not merely as an artefact of industrial archaeology, but as a monument to the history of the Spodden Valley, the interplay of natural forces, human enterprise and cultural memory. Beneath it, the river continues to carve its course through the gritstone, reshaping the landscape that first demanded such engineering. The railway's ghost lingers in the stone abutments, in the surviving weirs and sidings, and in the names of the villages that grew alongside its track. In its century of life, the Rochdale to Bacup line encapsulated the story of the Pennine Valleys themselves, born of geology, transformed by industry, reimagined by conservation. It bridged the age of steam and the age of nature's renewal, leaving behind not desolation but a sense of continuity, a landscape where history, legend and engineering meet. Walkers who cross the Healey Dell Viaduct today may not hear the rumble of trains, but in the quiet between the arches they can still sense the presence of the old line, echoing faintly against the rock and the river hundreds of feet below. Further down the old line towards Shawclough are two remarkable stone arches that locals know as the Twin Bridges, or as some call them, the Siamese Bridges. At first glance they seem identical, two solid gritstone bridges standing side by side, each with a single arch spanning the narrow valley floor. According to local accounts and heritage records, the first bridge here began to slip soon after completion, the ground beneath proving less stable than expected. Other theories suggest the bridge was simply built in the wrong location, and the story of soft ground being used rather than the builders admitting their error. Rather than dismantle it entirely, the railway engineers chose a simpler solution. They built a new bridge right alongside the first, slightly offset, creating the curious twin formation we see today. Over time, the two became inseparable, a permanent reminder of the challenges faced in building a railway through such rugged terrain. Each bridge is built from local gritstone, the same material used to create the Viaduct and Station Road Bridge, with a single graceful arch typical of Victorian railway engineering. Together they carried the Fassett branch line safely across the valley for decades until its closure. Today the twin bridges stand as part of Healey Dell's living history. Many people cross them daily, perhaps unaware of the story beneath their feet. The railway is long forgotten, but these curious structures remain, side by side, still holding their ground against the passage of years, just as they have since the day the engineers built the second to save the first. Healey Dell had long been a place of water wheels, mills and Victorian industry. By 1941, however, the valley was pressed into a very different kind of service. The steep sides and existing industrial buildings that had once turned wool and textiles into livelihoods were adapted, camouflaged and controlled to become a small but busy node in Britain's wartime munitions system, and assisted munitions filling works sited around Healey Hall Mill and its adjacent buildings. The final conversion in this old mill's story was pragmatic. The Ministry of Supply and the Royal Ordnance System needed space, buildings, links and transport that could be repurposed quickly. Old mill complexes with rail access were ideal. At Healey, the Vowys Mills, the nearby Rochdale to Bacup railway formation and Broadley Station made it straightforward to bring in empty casings and raw materials and to move out field ordnance without exposing major urban factories to unnecessary risk. Existing buildings were altered, new concrete bases and protective earthworks were laid down, and rail sidings were installed or adapted so the Vowy could handle a steady flow of materials. Once operational, the Healey Works was organised along the strict safety and procedural lines used across the country in filling factories. Halls for fillings, storage magazines, testing and dispatch were guarded by security and movement control. Because the site was an assisted filling factory operating under technical and managerial oversight from a larger Royal Ordnance factory complex, it combined local buildings and workers with central expertise, creating an efficient hybrid that multiplied Britain's capacity to arm aircraft and artillery quickly. Local histories and heritage summaries attribute very large production figures to Healey's wartime activity. The filling of vast numbers of small bombs and mortar rounds. Published accounts circulated in community records suggest Healey filled some 136 million 20-pound bombs intended for RAF use and around 4 million mortar bombs for the army during its period of operation. Such numbers, if taken at face value, underscore the role played by many dispersed converted sites across Britain. Not headline-grabbing factories, but high-throughput, highly repetitive works that cumulatively kept air forces and grain units supplied. Working inside a munitions filling factory was tightly regimented and often hazardous. The workforce in such sites typically included men from local trades, and very significantly, large numbers of women who entered munitions work as the war reshaped the labour market. Shift patterns, strict handling procedures, and the segregated layout of filling holes were designed to minimise accident risk. Still, the presence of explosives changed the daily life of the surrounding community. Local residents experienced restricted access to parts of the Dell, increased rail and road movements and heightened security measures. Photographs and maps demonstrate the extensive nature of the operation, bounded by miles of security fencing and reinforced by 5 pillboxes positioned across the Dell and on both banks of the River Spodden. The large complex consisted of a police post, contraband office, first aid post, chemistry labs, pump house, trailer pump garage, transformer house, magazine stores, electrical engineer's shop, air raid shelters, Nissen huts and dormer, administrative offices, pellet press room, bomb packing room, bomb filling room, bomb stores, boiler house, canteen stores, fitter's shop, toilets and a metal processing yard. By the middle and late 1940s, the intense wartime activity at Healey had wound down. Many local accounts indicate the works opened in 1941 and had closed by around 1943, with some later references suggesting the site was mothballed or held in reserve into the early post-war years. After closure, the valley gradually reverted to peacetime routines and the industrial buildings fell silent. Those weathered old fence posts which once protected the site still stand amongst the trees, as well as its numerous pillboxes scattered throughout the valley. Various businesses now occupy the old buildings. Garages, art studios, a nursery, and the popular Healey Dell Heritage Centre and tea rooms. Located in one of the old office buildings, its interior lavishly decorated in an Edwardian style now welcomes the many visitors who flock to the Dell. Modern day people walk curiously around the traces of that wartime chapter that remain amongst the more obvious beauty of waterfalls and woodland. The Dell's wartime chapter is an example of how Britain's industrial geography was mobilised in unexpected places. The Vowys' transformation from water-powered mill site to a small, tightly controlled filling factory and then back again toward nature and heritage shows how landscapes can carry hidden layers of history. Walking around the site today, it's possible to imagine the disciplined hum of wartime shifts in one ear and the quiet of the woods in the other, two realities laid over the same stretch of river each leaving its own mark on stone and soil. Hidden deep among the trees in the south of the valley lies what remains of a once mighty industrial empire, the Turner Brothers Asbestos Company. Once hailed as a symbol of innovation and progress, it would later become infamous as the birthplace of one of Britain's deadliest industrial legacies. The story begins in 1855 when Samuel Turner, a local entrepreneur, built a velvet mill at Clod Mill in the scenic valley. 16 years later, in 1871, Samuel joined forces with his brothers John and Robert to form Turner Brothers, a company initially focused on manufacturing cotton-based packings for steam engines and machinery. The early years were marked by skill, craftsmanship, and the ambition typical of the Victorian industrial age. But in 1879, a new material entered their workshop, a fibrous mineral that promised to change the world: asbestos. At the time, asbestos was celebrated as a miracle material. It was light yet strong, flexible yet durable, resistant to heat, fire and chemicals, perfect for the rapidly expanding industrial age. Turner Brothers became one of the first companies in Britain, and perhaps the world, to spin and weave asbestos into cloth on an industrial scale. The factory at Healey Dell grew to dominate the Spodden Valley, employing thousands of men, women and even teenagers. By the middle of the 20th century, the company was producing millions of yards of asbestos cloth and yarn each year, exporting insulation, brake linings, gaskets and fireproof materials across the globe. For decades, the white dust of asbestos hung in the air, settling on nearby trees, cars and the washing lines of local homes. Residents remember how it looked like snow, coating everything in a fine pale powder. Inside the factory, workers laboured without masks or ventilation, their hair and overalls covered in dust by the end of each shift. The dangers were hidden in plain sight. The first major warning came in 1924 with the tragic death of Nellie Kershaw, a 33-year-old spinner who had worked for Turner Brothers for many years. Nellie's lungs were found to be scarred and hardened by tiny asbestos fibres, the first documented case of what would later be called asbestosis. Her death became one of the earliest and most important medical investigations linking asbestos exposure to fatal disease. Yet Turner Brothers denied responsibility, refusing to contribute even to her funeral costs. The company continued production, even as doctors and inspectors began to raise concerns about the dust levels inside the mills. As the years passed, more and more workers and local residents developed asbestosis, lung cancer, and mesothelioma, illnesses that can take decades to appear after exposure. By the 1950s and 60s, the connection between asbestos and deadly disease was undeniable. But by then, Turner Brothers had become a giant of industry, supplying asbestos products worldwide. The company merged into Turner and Newall, a conglomerate that owned asbestos mines and factories across several continents. Locals recall how waste from the factory was dumped on nearby hillsides, or used to fill paths and roads. Children played on mounds of asbestos tailings, unaware of the danger. The white dust was everywhere, in the air, the soil, even washing down into the River Spodden. The valley's natural beauty hid a toxic undercurrent that would haunt generations. Production at Healey Dell finally ceased in the 1990s, and the massive industrial complex was left abandoned. Over time, the buildings fell into decay, the roofs collapsing, their machinery rusting, and the walls slowly reclaimed by vegetation. But beneath the overgrowth, asbestos contamination lingered in the soil, the trees, and the old drainage systems. In 2004, plans were announced to redevelop the former Turner Brothers site, by then referred to as the Spodden Valley site, into a housing estate of more than 600 homes. The proposal sparked outrage across Rochdale. Local campaigners, environmentalists and residents formed the group Save Spodden Valley, arguing that the land was dangerously contaminated and that disturbing it could release asbestos fibres into the air once more. Tests on the site revealed fragments and dust throughout the area, and the campaign grew into one of the largest environmental protests the town had ever seen. The controversy dragged on for years. Developers claimed the site could be safely managed, while campaigners demanded a full clean-up before any construction could begin. Councillors, health experts and local MPs became involved, calling for caution and transparency. Eventually, amid growing public pressure and environmental concerns, the housing proposal was withdrawn in 2011. Today, the old Turner Brothers site stands as both a relic and a warning. The sprawling ruins and overgrown paths tell the story of an industry that once powered Rochdale's economy, but at a devastating human cost. Thousands of workers across Britain and their families have died from asbestos-related diseases linked to factories like this one. Turner and Newell itself eventually collapsed under the weight of legal claims and compensation cases from victims around the world. For the people of Rochdale, the Turner Brothers story is not just a chapter in industrial history, it's a lesson written in dust and suffering. The site remains fenced off, derelict and unused, its future uncertain. Nature has reclaimed much of the site, with trees and wildlife thriving where factory floors once stood. Yet beneath the soil, hidden and silent, lies the toxic remnants of the dust that never truly settled. The Turner Brothers' legacy is one of human ingenuity, corporate denial and environmental consequences, a reminder that progress without caution can leave deep scars that last for generations. Healey Dell may look peaceful now, but its dark past lingers through the valley, a ghost of an industry that changed the world and the lives of countless people forever. Healey Dell has always been a place of quiet endurance, an ancient landscape shaped by both nature and human hands. The River Spodden carving its path for centuries before the first millstones turned, and long after the last train crossed the Viaduct, it still moves steadily through the valley, carrying echoes of all that came before. Once a place of noise and motion, mills buzzing with life, workers following the ritual of the water and the clock. Over time the noise faded, and the forest returned, softening the blemishes of industry until history and nature became one again. Every stone bridge and every worn path and every bend in the Spodden tells a tale, not just of work and progress, but of resilience and renewal. It's a reminder that even when human footprints fade, the land remembers. Healey Dell stands now as a living archive, a meeting place between what was and what remains. Its history isn't trapped in the past, it breathes in the stillness of the woods, in forgotten ruins, and in the steady rush of the river that has never stopped flowing.
Oh, sweet to the vision is Healey's famed dell, with its shady retreats and its pathways so green. What pen can describe it, what language can tell the charms and the beauty surrounding the scene? 'Tis a picture as fair as the Eden of old, where mankind's first parents were tempted and fell. Our hearts are enraptured whenever we behold the rich works of nature in Healey's cool dell. How grand to stroll there at the coming of spring, when the buds and the blossoms are fresh on the tree, to listen to the songbirds that soar as they sing, and inhale the pure fragrance that comes on the breeze. Our fancies, our thoughts, how delightful they are, too deep for expression, our bosoms they swirl. Life brings many pleasures, but dearest by far to me is a ramble through Healey's sweet dell. When the leaves by the zephyrs at nightfall are stirred, and darkness is lowering upon the earth's breast, The voice of the woodlark may often be heard as he calls for the mate of his choice to his nest. And the murmuring Spodden as it ripples along looks up at the daisy and nodding bluebell, which open their petals to list to its song that awakens their slumbers in Healey's fair dell. When the moon sheds her rays on the old ruined mill, there the maiden of Shawclough roams forth with her swain, and with breast beating high in that spot calm and still, he pleads for her hand, and he pleads not in vain. When troubles oppress me, I thither repair, and roam o'er the scenes that I love oh so well. For the Almighty's goodness is shown to me there, in the unrivaled beauties of famed Healey Dell. Oh, sweet to the vision is Healey's famed dell, with its shady retreats and its pathways so green. What pen can describe it? What language can tell the charms and the beauty surrounding the scene? 'Tis a picture as fair as the Eden of old, where mankind's first parents were tempted and fell. Our hearts are enraptured whenever behold the rich works of nature in Healey's cool dell. How grand to stroll there at the coming of spring, when the buds and the blossoms are fresh on the tree, to list to the songbirds that soar as they sing, and inhale the pure fragrance that comes on the breeze. Our fancies, our thoughts, how delightful they are, too deep for expression our bosoms they swirl. Life brings many pleasures, but dearest by far to me is a ramble through